Hi, I'm Scott Freiman from Deconstructing the Beatles, and you're listening to the Musicality Podcast.
Hi, this is Christopher Sutton, founder of Musical You, and welcome back to Beatles Month. Today I'm talking with Scott Freiman, the creator of Deconstructing the Beatles, a series of uniquely revealing multimedia presentations about the composition and production techniques of the Beatles. Scott has spoken about the Beatles to sold-out audiences, on college campuses, and for companies around the USA. He skillfully draws on original multitrack recordings to reveal exactly how the songs we know and love were put together, drawing out new and fascinating insights about the Beatles and their music. Scott is also a professional composer, and he's distilled some of the songwriting lessons he learned from the Fab Four into a terrific online course, Learn the Songwriting Secrets of the Beatles, which I found to be a great resource even for those who have no aspirations to write songs themselves, but just want to understand music better. As a composer himself, he said that what the Deconstructing the Beatles project has really shown him is how much work went into this music we know and love, just how creative the Beatles were and how that creative process happened step by step, not just individually, but collaboratively as a group. That's what we dig into in this interview. If these songs didn't magically spring into being overnight, what were the elements that made the band so unusually able to consistently write amazing songs that have stood the test of time? Scott has fantastic insight, and there's a ton to learn here for songwriters, composers, and for musicians and music fans as well. We talk about the development and growth the Beatles had already gone through as musicians before their recording career began, how his training as an editor has influenced how Scott sees their music, and how the Beatles themselves combined editing with experimentation. And we talk about one specific technique you can listen for in any music, but which the Beatles utilized in new and unusual ways. There are some really instructive and inspiring ideas in this conversation that I know you'll benefit from in your own music making and music listening. And it's going to make you hungry to go watch Scott's full presentations and maybe check out his songwriting course too. My name is Christopher Sutton, and you're tuned in to Beatles Month at Musical You. Welcome to the show, Scott. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
So I discovered you through Deconstructing the Beatles, and I was fascinated to learn that the man behind that project was in fact himself a composer and a musician in various roles. So I'd love to know where you came from as a musician and how it all led to such an epic project that is Deconstructing the Beatles.
Right. So I started out as a classical pianist, really learning, Mary Had a Little Lamb on the piano from my aunt at age 4. And I trained and entered contests and so forth. And when I went to college, I knew that I wanted to study music, but I knew I also wasn't good enough to be a real classical musician. So I learned an awful lot about theory, and what I always gravitated towards was the kind of taking apart or deconstructing classical pieces, learning the theory and the inspiration behind the pieces, and then putting it all back together. I always kind of liked that, and that was filed somewhere in the back of my mind. I learned, I was a classical pianist, and I taught myself pop and rock piano. And when I got into the Beatles when I was about 11 or 12, I started to figure out their songs, as a lot of musicians do, start with the Beatles. And so I always had a love for the Beatles. But just like any one of us, just a normal, like we appreciate the music. And, I did dive into some of the books a little bit, but that was about it. And then a few years ago, as I became a full-time musician, opened up a professional studio, wanted to get some people out to see the new studio and maybe get some business out of it. And I decided to put on a little talk on Strawberry Fields Forever and Sgt. Pepper. And the friends were producers and composers and other people from the New York area who had a music background. And they all said, you need to do something with that lecture. And so I started following up on some calls and teaching at a college, giving a lecture at a theater, just exploded from there. And here I am now, kind of an expert in the music of the Beatles with DVDs and lectures and so forth, and having a blast sharing my knowledge with other people.
Fantastic. And we'll be talking a lot more about Deconstructing the Beatles, but let's pause for a moment before we move on from your own musical journey. And you mentioned that you didn't think you were good enough to be a classical musician. What do you mean by that?
So technique-wise,
Hmm.
I was studying with a famous classical pianist, and some of his students, one in particular, who went on to fame and fortune, I could see that, even though I was second on the recital list, the difference between him and me was massive. I mean, this was a guy who practiced, you know, 10 hours a day or so forth, and I was doing my 1 hour practice a day. So I realized I didn't really have the passion to be a performer in that way. I always did enjoy playing pop music and accompanying choirs and things like that. But again, in college, I majored in music and I majored in technology, computer science. I didn't really know what to do with the music stuff. My friends at college went on to Broadway. They became rehearsal pianists. They became musical composers and so forth. I just didn't feel, that I had the same level of talent. So I enjoyed it. It was a passion. I still play. I still play in a band, and I have decent chops. But again, the difference between me and a professional, I think, is massive.
Gotcha. And you did have a kind of draw to songwriting, I think. You mentioned you got into the songs of the Beatles and you were enjoying deconstructing songs, and that kind of led to going more into composing. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah. So after I had a brief detour for 15 years in the business world, and kept the music going, and then when I sold my company, I said, now I really do want to follow the music side and composing, but specifically film composing,
Hmm.
because I found that I loved writing little songs and especially funny songs, songs for kids. But in terms of more sweeping scores and so forth, I liked responding to visual media. I like to have something to reflect off of, to interpret, and to see how the music can enhance the scene. And so my focus was really in trying to get into film and TV. And that, by the way, led me to editing, because a lot of the smaller projects, I would either come in as an editor and end up writing some cues for it, or they would hire me as a composer, and I'd have to edit some dialogue or edit some sound effects. And so the music editing and the composing, to me, I kind of treated it as, there's an audio palette to a video or to a film or to a TV show. And music is part of that palette. It has to serve the video. And I like that a lot. And that's kind of where I was directed.
Interesting. I don't want to take us on too much of a detour here, but I am super curious. You said something there that you realized that it was the visual context where you were really interested in composing. Did that come out of the editing work you just mentioned, or was that prior? Had something given you a taste for that, or how did you know that would be interesting for you?
So I always loved film music,
Hmm.
and the first time it really dawns on you when you see a really great, film clip and the music just makes the scene, and you realize how important it is. And, there are a lot of really talented composers who can't work in film and TV because they want their music to be the focus.
Hmm.
And in reality, it can't be. It has to serve the bigger vision of the director and of the visuals. It's not meant to take you away from that. And I really like that. I like being able to see if I could paint a picture and sound that helped enhance the scene. So it all tied into the editing, but I always listened to film music. I loved listening to scores. The scores that stand alone outside the film are great, but then when you see it against picture and oh wow, look how it really makes that scene and how it fits and how it doesn't take away from things. And I mean that's really where it's a lot of fun.
I see. And I was really reminded hearing you describe that kind of editing work and being in the trenches and cutting and, making it all fit together. I was really reminded of the presentations you give on the Beatles, and particularly the one I watched yesterday was Deconstructing Sergeant Pepper, and the way you dig into the multi-track recordings and kind of pick it apart piece by piece. I can kind of see the editor's mind at work there.
Well, one of the things that I think about the craft of songwriting is I do think there is editing involved. I think it's maybe self-editing, it may be a producer editing you, a collaborator putting together, even if you're putting together loops, you're editing them together. It is editing in a way. And So when you kind of take apart the music into its pieces and see how they are put together, it's kind of how do you edit them together. So there's definitely a parallel between editing in the traditional sense of cutting and splicing and lining things up, and editing in terms of creating a song, composing and writing.
So when you described that first lecture or presentation you gave on the music of the Beatles, it sounds like things really snowballed from there and it took on a life
Yes,
of its own and you had
yes, it did.
such a great reaction to it. How did that play against the fact that you were pursuing your own music? Did the two relate to each other? Were they separate projects, or how did they coexist?
Well, it just became. It's a good question. It became a sort of one of many things I was doing with music. My goal when I embarked on a career in music was to really do everything. Instead of just concentrating, which some people do, and that's great. I wanted to cast a wider net, especially in New York where I was. In LA, you can get into the scene a little bit easier than you can in New York. So in New York, I felt you needed to be able to edit, you needed to be able to compose, you needed to be able to mix. So I was trying to do all of these things. And the Deconstructing the Beatles lectures were a great way for me to use those skills in a unique way. But also, frankly, I was trying to meet other, directors and producers. So it was a great introduction because people would come to see my lectures, would hear them say Scott Freiman is a composer, and they'd want to talk to me after the show and say, "Oh, you're a composer too? We should talk. I have a project." So it was really an excuse to meet people, and that's really not jumping too off in the distance here, but that's how I got my current job because someone saw me at a Beatles lecture. And my current job is I'm running a music tech company that is revolutionizing the way music is cleared and licensed and the way composers report their music in cue sheets so that they can get paid royalties. And I found out about the opportunity because someone saw me at a Beatles lecture and started meeting with composers, listening to their issues and their problems. And we formed this company, and now we're doing that. So it's an example of trying different things because you never know where they're going to lead. And in this case, I had no idea where a lecture on the Beatles would take me, but it was fun. It was getting good reaction. I was meeting people, and there you have it.
Very cool. And that company you mentioned there is Quire, is that right?
That's correct.
QWIRE.
QWIRE, that's right.
Awesome. Well, from my conversations with recording artists and composers, that is an area ripe for innovation and for somebody not to overstate it, but to fix it. So yes. It's important work you're doing.
It's a whole nother talk, but let's just say that it's incredibly archaic in the way all this work is done, and that's why composers don't get the royalties they should, and songwriters don't get the royalties they should, and in order to fix that problem, it requires technology, and that's what we're working on.
Fantastic. So for the people listening who are starting to get a sense of what Deconstructing the Beatles is all about, could you just give them the kind of nutshell summary of the project and the different presentations you've developed as part of that?
Sure. So Deconstructing the Beatles, I describe it as a way of gaining a new appreciation for the creative process, especially when it comes to the Beatles, but it applies beyond the Beatles. How do you get inspired to write a song? How do you arrange the song? What kind of transitions does it go through from idea to finished product? And that's what it's about. And I gear my lectures for a fairly wide audience. So I have songwriters and producers who really gravitate towards, what mic were they using and where was it placed, to songwriters who want to know about the theory, to people who are just fans and they want to know some of the stories. And I find whether you're, a kid or a college student who knows the songs but doesn't have any of the historical context, or you're a baby boomer who grew up with the Beatles, there's something to be gained. And so that I try and put together the story of an album or the story of a time period and show how the Beatles were evolving as musicians.
Terrific. And you show it so well through explanation and examples and audio tracks where you can really hear the point you're making. It's fantastic. But what I wanted to ask you was, We talk on this show quite often about talent and the idea of being gifted in
Mm,
music. And the Beatles are one of, if I had to list them, it's probably one of the top three names that will always be brought up in a conversation about that kind of thing. Well, Lennon and McCartney, they didn't know any music theory. They just wrote the songs and they just had the gift. And you have studied not just those albums for the presentations and their various works, but recently you put together a new Birth of the Beatles presentation all about where they came from in those early years. And so I'd love to hear your perspective on that and how much of a journey was involved in getting to the point where we have these amazing songs we all know and love.
right. So there are a lot of kids, teenagers who can strum a few chords on a guitar and you have a decent voice that are not Lennon and McCartney. So what's the difference? So clearly, I think they were incredibly gifted and incredibly creative, and very much personalities who wanted to continue to push things. So that's part of it. Part of it was listening, their ears. They listened to everything. And you hear them tell these stories about playing in Liverpool or in Hamburg, where they were playing with all these other bands who were other Beatles-like bands. But they would get ready to go on stage, and they'd hear the band going, singing Long Tall Sally. They'd go, oh, no, that's part of our set. What do we do now? And so they started learning B-sides, and they started pulling out a Fats Waller tune or a Peggy Lee tune or things that they knew the other groups weren't playing. So this gave them exposure to different styles of music. It forced them to learn very quickly huge repertoires of music. And that was all part of this evolution, because when they started to really write songs, consciously or unconsciously, they were grabbing chord patterns or rhythm patterns or ideas from these songs they were performing, and then they were adding to that and making it their own. So I would say, beyond their personalities, which made them sort of primed, if you will, to become the Beatles, it was the fact that they listened to everything. And when you talk about, Malcolm Gladwell talks about the 10,000 hours of performing. Absolutely, they performed and performed and performed. But so were Rory Storm and the Hurricanes. So were King Size Taylor and the Dominoes. These other groups were doing that. They were performing. What was different about the Beatles? They were really determined to make it big. They were listening to everything. They were continually adding new music to their sets, and they were trying the craft of songwriting. And I think that was really important. And that got them to the point where they could find their way to meet George Martin. And then things get even more progressive with them, because what I talk about in The Birth of the Beatles is getting them to Abbey Road. What I talk about in The Beatles of 1963, which is the other recently released DVD, is what happened when they meet George Martin. And Martin had a classical background, he had the arranging background, he knew how to work in a studio, all stuff that the Beatles didn't have. So put that all together, these creative people who are dying to learn, who want to do new things, who are creative, and who are hungry to, great work ethic, and pair them with a guy who says, I have the stuff you're missing, and I can work with you, put it together, and that gives you the Beatles. And that's, in my opinion, how this all comes together, is, they had to be ready for George Martin, and George Martin had to say, I'm willing to work with these guys. But once that connection was made, that set them on the road to being, the Beatles we know and love.
That's fascinating, and it's such a different perspective, I think, than a lot of us inherit culturally. Like, we just have this mythology around the Beatles, and
Yes.
to hear you describe it just then, there was a real process to it. There was a real story. There were, characters like George Martin who had an important role to play. Aside from just the Fab Four, it wasn't them in a bubble magically writing amazing songs. That there was
Right.
there was a reality to this.
Yeah. And by the way, I say the same thing about songwriting, is that, a lot of people think these Beatles songs, McCartney sat down with the guitar and the song was done. And they get frustrated because they know it doesn't come that easy to them. But the truth is, and one of the things I try and bring out in these lectures, is that these songs, maybe the ideas came quickly, but they were worked on. And especially in those early days with Paul and John collaborating, Paul would toss something out and John would say, that lyric, that's lyric stinks, got to replace that. And John would write a song and say, I need a bridge. And Paul would put in the bridge and they'd work on that. They'd work on the harmonies. These songs were crafted. As simple as they seem to us, there's a lot of craft that went into there. And that, to me, is what songwriting is about. It's not the speed at which you can write something. It's how do you take a good idea and make it better through the craft, through, really getting rid of the stuff that doesn't work for the song, adding that really interesting chord or that dynamic change or that shift that makes the song more interesting, adding that hook which grabs the listener. Beatles were really good at that stuff. And that comes from a lot of that listening they were doing, a lot of that performing. They could see the crowd reaction when they did certain things. And George Martin adding in, here's a little bit of, here's a better way of doing the harmonies, or here's a cool production technique we can use. There you have it.
I see. So it sounds like it's a mix of editing and experimentation to get them from, the initial idea for a song to the final produced recording. Is that right?
Yes. And again, I think that people have this concept of sort of the Sgt. Pepper era, Revolver, Sgt. Pepper. They're doing all this fun stuff in the studio. And yes, that's true. But even early on, a song like Things We Said Today or And I Love Her or If I Fell, In My Life, these are songs that they might have, Paul might have dreamt of yesterday in bed and went downstairs and wrote it down or recorded it. But it took George Martin working with him to do that string arrangement to really make that song what it is today, as beautiful as McCartney's lyric and melody were. Other songs, you hear them go through evolutions, and you hear them trying little things in the studio, little things, let's add a little harmonica there or whatever. That's the craft. And it's kind of fun to see some of those decisions they made early days, but even all the way through to their final albums.
And for you as a composer yourself, what have been the most interesting discoveries or learning points as you picked apart these tracks and dug into the backstories and the evolution of each song? Are there any things that you took away and it changed how you thought about composing?
Yes. I think certainly if you study the Beatles, what they called, the middle eights, the bridges of their songs. And again, a lot of these songs we know by heart, right? We've listened to them 1,000 times. We never really dug in and taken them apart. And you see, how does that bridge function? How does it take you a different path? And then when you come back to the verse or the chorus, you have this, you feel great about that. And it's going from a major to a minor, or from a minor to a major, or going to a relative minor, or just these shifts. How do they do that? How does that bridge help complete the song? I think, especially in doing my songwriting course, taking apart some of these bridges, was like, oh, that's so cool, how they do that. So certainly that's kind of a little thing that they were really good at, is how do we make the song more interesting? So it's not just verse, chorus, a bridge in the same key, then another verse, chorus, and we're done. And those little tricks are great. Those little chords that take you in a different place, like there was one that got John Lennon very excited in I Want to Hold Your Hand. I'll tell you something. I think you understand. And it's like a minor chord coming out of nowhere. It doesn't sound that revolutionary today. Back in the day, very revolutionary. And there are a lot of those things all the way through. I just did lectures on Abbey Road. And some of the things George Harrison does in Something are just beautiful. Paul's bass line, So I'm kind of giving you a bigger answer, but I think there are these, what gives me is a great appreciation for the nuances in their songwriting and in their arrangements. Absolutely. And there's something really wonderful about hearing the first take of While My Guitar Gently Weeps with George on the guitar. It's just beautiful. The recent box set of the White Album that just came out has an early take of John trying different guitar picking and guitar strumming on Julia. and talking about how he wants to approach the singing of the song. Hearing those things and hearing them work at the song, I find very inspirational.
Fantastic. There's something I'm struggling a bit to put into words that I want to ask you about there, which is we've talked a bit about them experimenting and trying different things, and some of the examples you just gave, a lot of people hearing them would be like, it's music theory stuff. So the way they've thrown in that other chord, or the way they've done the bass line, there's music theory rules about that kind of thing. And, one of the other things that the Beatles are often held up as an example of is folks who didn't know music theory but still wrote amazing songs.
Yes.
And I guess what I'm reaching for is, how much were these innovations kind of random experimentation until something clicked, or how much did they have kind of tricks and a toolkit that they brought out again and again in different songs?
So definitely more on the experimentation side, but they knew enough to say, I want to do something different. Originally it was, I want to do something different in the song. Later it was, I want my voice to sound different or my guitar to sound different. But take a song like Your Blues from the White Album. It's a blues song. It's a 12-bar blues, but it's not. It goes along like a 12-bar blues, and all of a sudden there's an extra measure thrown in and an extra chord thrown in, and it goes into a different place. So it's pretty much a blues, but it's not exactly a 12-bar blues. And for the most part, all of their songs have something that makes it slightly different than what you would expect, a slight little twist, going in a slightly different direction. A song like Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds moves through 3 tonal areas. The verse with the arpeggios is one part, the B section, and then the chorus is a different section. One part's in 3/4, one part's in 4/4. Just try and write a song with neighboring keys. I think it's, trying to remember what it is. It's like E flat, A flat, C. It's something really close. It's really, really hard to do. And yet no one listening to Lucy in the Sky is thinking, wow, this is a really hard song to sing, right? It's beautiful. So, but I think that's all ear. That's like, wow, that's a kind of cool chord. Let me see if I can go off in this direction. Much more so than any knowledge of music theory, which they did not have.
Gotcha. And I think one thing that's remarkable is that they didn't innovate, come up with some clever ideas, and then kind of rinse and repeat, right? It's like every year or every album, they came up with a whole new, fresh set of twists on the common uses.
Yeah, there are a few bands. So one of the things that sets the Beatles apart is there are a few bands who kind of reinvent themselves with every album. There are people like, I think Bowie did that clearly. I think that to a large extent Radiohead has been doing that. Maybe Queen. Other people, some people do like a concept album or something like that. But it's general, like it's them. With the Beatles, when you got a Beatles album, it was like, wow, who's this group, right? The difference between Hard Day's Night, which is 64, Rubber Soul, which is 65, and Revolver, which is 66, and the White Album, which is 68. I mean, they're 4 completely different groups. And that amount of change in that short period of time is really what makes them so amazing. I mean, they were really only together for about 8 years as a recording artist, and the transformation was astounding.
You mentioned something there that jumped out at me from your Sgt. Pepper presentation, which was about it being often seen as a concept album. And there is obviously this idea behind it that they are Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. But you made a really interesting point about that, and I wonder if you could share that.
So it's not really a concept album in terms of what Paul was originally envisioning, which is we can pretend we're this band and maybe tell the story of this band or something. There's no story, right? But if you look at the songs on Sgt. Pepper, I believe each one takes you into a different world. You've got different characters like Lucy, Mr. Kite, Lovely Rita. Each song is a different style. You go from the carnival to India to music hall. You're bouncing around. And so it's almost like the band is leading you on the tour of these different characters and these different styles of music. So in that sense, it holds together for me. But it's not a Tommy. It's not, there's not a story attached to it.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think it's so interesting. And I think part of what I loved about your presentation was hearing the stories behind the songs. And I'm not somebody who goes big on like band trivia. I probably would struggle to tell you the names of the members of Radiohead, for example, despite them being one of my favorite bands. I don't hero worship musicians. I just hero worship their music. And so it was surprising to me just how much I enjoyed hearing the backstory of the songs. And I think it's because, aside from these fascinating tidbits along the way, like John Lennon writing Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite from a circus poster, a real poster advertising a circus, that was fantastic. Aside from that kind of fascination, I think it was that it humanized it all. You know, when you tell the story of one of these songs' origins, I can kind of get a feel that, okay, the Beatles were actual people, and these songs didn't spring out into the world out of nowhere.
Yes, yeah. And I think what it does is it says, as a songwriter, anything can be inspiration, as trivial as a poster hanging on your wall or the latest, the newspaper, like A Day in the Life. The newspaper was an inspiration for John. He was just staring at it. Cornflakes commercial for Good Morning, Good Morning, salt and pepper shakers. Salt and Pepper became Sergeant Pepper. I mean, so songwriters are thinking about this stuff. I know songwriters who carry a notebook with them and they hear someone say an interesting phrase and they write it down. I mean, that's great. Inspiration can come from anywhere. And the fun part about hearing the backstories of the songs is you learn that the Beatles, again, there's no magic to where you get your song inspiration from. It can be anything as trivial or as non-trivial as you want, right?
Absolutely. And apart from this deconstructing series where you're taking apart particular tracks and particular albums, you also have, as you mentioned before, a songwriting specific tutorial series. It's a course online, which is Songwriting Secrets of the Beatles. And I loved one of the points you made in that in a sense what draws together a lot of the material you were sharing there was this idea of tension and release in music, and how the Beatles used chords and progressions in different ways to create that. I wonder if you could talk a bit about that and maybe an example or two of how the Beatles created tension and released it in a different way than we're maybe used to.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So I think a lot of music, including classical and jazz, a lot of the great music plays with your expectations. Beethoven was a master at this. He would set up the theme, and then he would take you on this journey and somehow bring you back to the theme. And Mozart and Haydn, they had this sonata form where you would bring back the theme, but then you would somehow shift it so that instead of taking you to a different key, it took you to the key of the piece, and you would end that way. And how did they do that trick was always kind of fun. In a lot of ways, that's what the Beatles did with their songwriting. So they would create tension. Here's some examples. They would do things like hold on to a dominant chord, right? Think of Day Tripper, where dum da 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 da. The bridge builds and builds and builds, and the Beatles are singing ahs and ahs, and it's just going and going and going and going, and then suddenly, boom, ba da 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 da, right? It comes back. I mean, you can picture the girls screaming in the audience like that, right? They knew that was one of those tricks that they knew. She loves you. The pause at the end. With a love like that, you could be glad, right? I can't hide. I can't hide. I can't hide. I want to hold your hand, and then bam, back. So that's how you kind of can do it in your lyrics, in your the structure, but you can also do it with chords as well. You could take someone into a different place, and a good example of that is Something. The verse is in C, the bridge is in A major, and at the end of the song, it takes you away from the A major, and you come back, you land in the C, and he does that with a little trick, and those little tricks are kind of setting up, making the ending really feel good. It feels like it's all resolved. So you can do it with chords by taking someone to a different place and then prolonging the return to the tonic. You can do it in the structure of the song where you hold a lyric phrase or a riff or a chord a little longer, and then bring them back. Those were some of the things that the Beatles did from their earlier tracks all the way to something on Abbey Road. So.
Terrific. I always love on this show when we can talk about the listener's experience of music and how we can think about the music we're making and how it affects the listener. And that idea of tension and release, it's such a versatile one that you can, go away and listen to your favorite Beatles album and just ask yourself, like, where are they creating tension and how? And even if you don't know the music theory terminology or the concepts behind it, you know as a listener, okay, it's building up and now it's releasing.
That's right. And a lot of it's subconscious, right? I mean, the problem I have with a lot of the music of drum and bass and things like that is that the way they create tension is, the drums drop out. And then when the drums come back in, everyone, starts dancing again. But that's the same thing. It's creating tension. You're like waiting for the drop. And, when it all comes back, everyone's happy. But it's so much more interesting to me to try and do it through the structure of the chords or the structure of the song. But it's difficult. It's not as simple as, I just maybe hold a chord for a bar longer, because it has to work. It has to be memorable. It has to be hooky. It has to be something that people want to sing. And, that's what the good songs, the best songs do, in my opinion. I mean, even a song on a single chord, you can have things that you do in your phrasing to kind of take the listener along for a ride and maybe hold something for a little bit to bring back that tension.
And I imagine that's a fairly major component of effective film scoring for you too, as a soundtrack composer.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, a big thing is how do you do that without again taking away from the action, right? You can pound brass and have cymbals crashing and so forth, but the most effective horror movie scores, if you think about it, could be a single string note just holding, and the audience is extremely tense because something's going to happen, but it's not big, it's small. So all kinds of ways to create tension. And again, studying the Beatles music and looking at picking almost any song and looking at the ways that they might have made the song more interesting. You find a lot of them have to do with how do we take how do we take listeners in a different place? How do we prolong something and then release it in a satisfying way? Things like that.
Gotcha. And so I have to wonder, having gone into composing yourself and studied the Beatles in such depth, as a Beatles fan and a songwriter, composer in your own right, how has your opinion of the Beatles or your perspective on them changed from the beginning of this project through to where you are now?
Yeah, a great question. I would say that before I started all of this, I thought the Beatles were great musicians, great songwriters, love the songs, clearly inspiration for other groups. What this project, this big Deconstructing the Beatles project, has done is it really showed me how much work went into this music and really how creative they were. I mean, how they can, put together a masterpiece like Rubber Soul in 30 days. I mean, how do you do that? And how do they collaborate? One of the keys, I think, to the Beatles' career is the collaborative element between the four Beatles. And hearing tracks develop, learning how they worked in the studio, even hearing some of the chatter when I get a chance to do that is really interesting. You can hear them evolving, suggesting ideas, moving things along. So that, I think that the craft and how creative these guys actually were and what their work ethic was like, that is really what has changed the most for me, is that I appreciated them. Now I really appreciate them.
Wonderful. Well, you clearly have your hands full doing important work at Choir in rights management and licensing, but I've been binge watching all of your streaming presentations, and so I have to ask, are there more Deconstructing Beatles projects on the way? Can we hope for more in the future?
So we have out quickly Rubber Soul, Revolver, Sgt. Pepper, White Album, early Beatles, 1963 Beatles. Magical Mystery Tour will be out on DVD. It's currently in theaters nationwide in the U.S., and it will be out on DVD early 2019. And then we just filmed Abbey Road. And Abbey Road was kind of like my white whale because I just didn't know how I was going to fit it into one lecture. And the answer was, it's 2 lectures. It's one on side 1, one on side 2. And the reaction has been great. So that will be coming out into theaters probably mid 2019, and then out on DVD in the fall. And then it'll be on to probably Let It Be. And I have one planned for 64, 65. And maybe one on after the Beatles, after the breakup, and then we'll see.
Fantastic. Well, I'm deeply reassured to hear there is more coming for me because I am looking forward to those. The best place to find those is at deconstructingthebeatles.com, is that right?
That is correct, and that will give you trailers. I have a lot of smaller videos on different aspects of the Beatles, which are kind of fun. And then there's also a link where you can see all the DVDs, including the composing, the songwriting secrets of the Beatles course, which is what you were talking about earlier.
Fantastic. Well, it's been such a pleasure to get to talk to you, Scott, and thank you for creating such fascinating presentations because they really are a treat to watch, as well as being, I think, very instructional and inspiring for aspiring songwriters and music lovers in general. So just a big thank you for joining us on the show today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed the chat, and I hope we'll get to do it again sometime.
Would you like to hear more, enjoy more, and understand more in every piece of music you listen to? Active listening holds the key, and we're about to launch an exciting, brand new way to learn active listening, step by step, with music of every genre and era, including the Fab Four themselves. For full details, visit musicalitypodcast.com/hear more. That's musicalitypodcast.com/hear more, where you'll also get access to an exclusive time-limited special offer. Act fast and visit musicalitypodcast.com/hear more today.